as we know from all crises, the private sector is always the one that fails. It's always the one that needs help. It wasn't big banks that were handing over loads of money to Ben Bernanke to fund the Fed. So the way around, he just moved the numbers up. He looked at all these failing private sector businesses and simply handed over the money, because the state, as we all know, spends money into existence. The government can never be revenue constrained with money. It doesn't need the private sector to support the public sector. You might argue it's good to have a private sector because the private sector provides flexibility, innovation, freedom, all these things the private sector does. But that's because the public sector creates the environment for it to function in. Liz Truss, she's not a fan of the public sector, but she certainly sees it as something that feeds from the private sector, whereas really it's the other way around.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard our guest this week, author and economist Dr. Phil Armstrong. And in a moment, we'll be talking to him about the meaning of two exciting new terms that have just been added to the lexicon of the dismal science: Trussonomics and fiscal event. If you're new to MMT, you can listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction. But if you want to dive in here, money's completely made up. Anyone can have a go. But as Professor Hyman Minsky once said, the challenge is to get it accepted. And the way governments do it is to impose tax liabilities on their citizens denominated in the thing they want to be money. Here in the UK, we call that thing the British pound, and that's why we're still using it to pay each other with over here, no matter how weak it gets against other currencies. That's not to downplay the market's reaction to the Conservative Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng's recent whatever that was. We only need to cast our minds back to the days following the Brexit referendum to be reminded that currency traders trade in accordance with what they think other people will think about certain events. And so their thoughts about other people's thoughts have impacts. And you can listen to our last episode with Professor John T. Harvey for more on what influences that tiny sector of humanity's thoughts and therefore the whole world's currency prices. The following conversation was recorded before the fiscal event. Sorry, I'm still getting used to saying it. And its aftermath is still unfolding as I record this. And all things being equal, we'll have more reaction to it in next week's episode. Our aim here was to talk about Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's economic views on what they might mean for their time in office. So apologies if they've already been ousted by the time you hear this, but there's still a lot to enjoy in the conversation. For canine enthusiasts like myself, if you listen closely, you'll occasionally hear the gentle padding paws of Bobby, the Basenji African barkless dog, who Phil was looking after on behalf of his nephews Tom, Rob and Harry. And I think that gave the conversation that authentic fireside chat feel that we've been striving for years. So thank you, Bobby. If you're listening, I just checked the markets and they all say, you're a good boy. You'll also hear Phil talk about exogenous and endogenous views of money. If those are new words to you, don't panic. We've got a whole episode about them and what they mean, and it's really good. You're welcome. That's our episode 43 with Sam Levy. And finally, at the end, we briefly mentioned the Enough is Enough campaign, which is organising to fight the cost of living crisis here in the UK. And they're planning a national day of action on October the 1st in various towns and cities. And so I've linked to where you can find out more about that in the show notes for this episode, where, as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And we're delighted to be joined today by our friend, economist and author, Dr. Phil Armstrong. Thanks for joining us today, Phil.
Great to be back.
So, since we last spoke, the UK is under new management in all kinds of ways, but perhaps only superficial ones. And so we're going to talk about the substance of the economic ideas of these people who have been nominally put in charge of the country. Liz Truss is now Prime Minister, beating former Chancellor Rishi Sunak to the job. And that was a very exciting race for people who like to watch two mediocre at best people competing for the job of running an awful organisation to do awful things to a country already on its knees as a result of the policies of that awful organisation. But the one thing we can take from it is we know what the new Prime Minister's possibly authentic positions are on a lot of things, because she only had to pander to a small sliver of the population that has a vote in a Conservative leadership race, rather than a slightly broader electorate that might include slightly less arch Conservatives. And we're about to see how sincerely she holds these policy positions, because in a few days' time, as we record this, the new Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, will deliver a mini budget. But before we get into that, Phil, do you have any overarching thoughts about Liz Truss or the people around her at the moment?
I'm trying to be polite, really. I mean, having no idea what they're doing would be a kind of a good summary. I was thinking a little bit about it, and I think there's kind of two ridiculously unrealistic strands of conservative thinking, and they're often at together, but sometimes in tension. One of the ideas they have is sound money. It's crucial, sound money. So the idea that from a governments are naturally profligate, they're not very efficient. And so what you've got to do is make the state as small as possible and avoid at all costs running up public sector debt, because if you do that, well, it has to be paid back. It's going to drive up interest rates. It's going to crowd out our wonderful private sector that generates all the real creativity. We've got this sense of keeping the state as small as possible, sound money, making sure you don't live beyond your means, which you're all familiar with. And this, be careful, you can't afford tax cuts at the wrong time, because although we'd love to do it, we've got to be careful. And that's a strong element of conservatism. But in tension with that is this idea that the private sector is absolutely fantastic. And if we can afford to take risks with the public finances, because the private sector is so powerfully wonderful. So in other words, we can afford to cut taxes, because, if you cut taxes, what will happen is the private sector will respond and think, great, our income tax has gone down a couple of percent. We're going to work tons harder, and the economy is going to get richer. So it's that idea. I don't know if you've talked before with any of your guests about the Laffer curve. If my memory serves me right, whether the story is quite comedic, but how accurate it is, has various variants, that a guy was talking to an economist in I think it was somewhere in New York, and sketched out a tax revenue and tax rate. Now, as far as I know, the two guys involved, I could be wrong, were Arthur Laffer himself, Laffer, and a Wall Street Journal journalist. I'm not absolutely certain it was those two. And the basic idea is drawn on the back of a table napkin. And the idea is, if you had a tax rate of 0, your revenue would be 0, because you're not earning anything. Whereas if you had a tax rate of 100%, no one would work. So therefore, because they're going to lose all the money, what's the point in doing that? So therefore, if you had a tax rate of 0 or a tax rate of 100%, your revenue's still 0. So there must be a line where if you increase, if you kind of imagine increasing your tax rate from 0, your revenue goes up, and then it must at some point fall back towards 0, logically. So given, of course, the Wall Street Journal journalist and Arthur Laffer were necessarily thinking, well, let's assume that our tax rate is higher, so it's past the peak. If we cut the tax rate, we can see that the tax revenue will rise. So you think the rate is obviously going down, but the revenue is going up. Well, why is that? Well, of course, from a right-wing point of view, the argument is cut your tax rates. Then people will be so in kind of, wow, it's great, I'm going to work harder. They're going to work harder and the government will get more taxes. So that means you actually cut the tax rate and get more revenue. Now, if you imagine these things are kind of in tension. On the one hand, the idea is let's deregulate the system, let's cut taxes and unleash the wonderful productive power of the private sector. And see how we go. And, if we cut the tax rate, we'll get more revenue. We'll go into a glorious future, which seems to be the Liz Truss Kwarteng approach, go for growth, 2.5%, as opposed to sort of the other strand of conservatism, which is, whoa, that's a bit risky. Now isn't the time for tax cuts. So they're kind of playing the sound money card. Now, you might argue they're both equally ridiculous because they're both based against the wrong backdrop. The old government needs to collect money in taxes before it can spend. But to me, that's, in a nutshell, sort of the change in dimension from Rishi, who was more of, if you like, a steady hand on the tiller type Tory who's thinking we've got to be careful. We don't want to overdo it with our spending. If we can avoid it, our post-furlough. Now isn't the time for tax cuts. We've got to be thinking about sound money, risk, keep the risks down. As opposed to Liz, who's gone back to the old 80s sort of supply side economics. You cut your tax rates and the economy will fly. So that's my initial broad opinion. It's equally bad, but just different bad.
I agree. I think Rishi Sunak is one of those naive conservatives who actually think that the Tories care about the deficit. So I think I summarized that Rishi Sunak's biggest mistake was assume that the Tories cared about sound finance more than they cared about low taxes. And the popularity of Liz Truss has obviously proved him wrong. But I honestly don't understand even, what her justifications, for example, on the bankers' bonuses. She says, we're going to remove the cap because that's going to create growth. Well, how? How are bankers' bonuses going to create growth? Even from a Laffer perspective, I don't really understand that.
I mean, it's difficult to know exactly how people's minds work when they're a bit crazy, as you said. But I think it's a very generalised faith in the idea that if you cut taxes or you allow bigger bonuses for bankers or you deregulate or get rid of red tape, it's going back to the 1980s. Like they talk about on wildlife shows, build yourself a pond and they will come, like frogs will arrive and stuff, and you don't have to do anything.
But is there any evidence of the finance sector?
Oh no, there's no evidence, but it's not meant to be evidential. It's basically the idea that if you get rid of the cap, that there are some things called top bankers out there, the best people, whatever that might mean. And obviously, all these super intelligent, wonderfully gifted bankers, financial people, will come to London because now they can earn like triple their salary and bonus. And in a magical sense, that'll make the city more competitive. And they added, chuck the Laffer curve in the pot because they're all working so hard because they're having, and get these bonuses. The government will get loads more in tax revenue. But in answer to your question, I don't see any evidence. No evidence like names, dates, data, statistics for that, to my knowledge, has ever been produced. It's just a non-empirical idea that they will come, that somewhere out there are wonderful bankers that will come and they will emerge and the city will kind of almost pupate from it's now like a caterpillar trapped in a cocoon of regulation. And out will fly this wonderful butterfly of great British, wonderful private sector driven growth. But that's as far as it goes. It doesn't have any evidence behind it, not that I can tell. And I honestly can't see how it's got any logic. But it sounds good to the type of Tories who like Truss. And I suppose some Tories, I don't know the minds of the Tories, but they're relatively small membership, quite old. And a lot of them still like Boris and saw Rishi as someone who'd kind of stabbed him in the back or something. They voted for Truss instead. And she was the one I didn't want any of them, but she was the most embarrassing one to represent Britain. I thought I'm not a fan, obviously, of any of the Tories, but at least somebody like Rishi kind of looks the part. He's using the wrong model.
I knew that he'd lost it when, he was desperately flailing around in the leadership bid for things to say, and he started blaming lefty lawyers in Europe for things. And I thought he's trying to sort of appeal to the people who are always frothing about like the so-called woke brigade or something like that. I think he used the term woke lefty lawyers. So he was trying to dog whistle, hey, I'm gonna, and it's like, nah, you're not that guy. You're not going to, outflank Liz Truss on the right. Like that, and so I kind of, I thought he's getting desperate at that point. But I think what perhaps explains their posture is that the Conservative Party's main donors now are hedge funders and property developers. So if you follow the money, they're going to have to prioritize high net wealth individuals or lose the contributions, but they've still got to say something to align themselves or appear to align themselves with the regular people. So we're going to be hearing a lot about growing the pie and rising tides lifting all boats, like you say, back to the 80s.
That's what I mean. And like even with that kind of idea that low taxation produces more economic activity, then you could have just as easily applied it to other areas of the economy, But she focused on bankers' bonuses because most of her donors are bankers, presumably. And the same thing with the energy cap. She's now subsidizing the energy sector, and that is not going to help people on the lower end of the income scale at all.
No, I mean, it's the old, trickle-down theory back under another nib, and we have gone back 40 years, it seems to me. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't any small differences. I mean, I think what you say is absolutely true. At the end of the day, their donors probably have a lot of city interests, financial interests, so they want to deregulate the city. And obviously, a lot of the things that the more liberal wing of the Tory party might have accepted up to a point, like the need maybe to go easy on fracking and things like that, to have some basic sense of the public mood over the environment. All that's gone out of the window. Or it seems to be in what I've read, that the big areas that have really been a push under the more liberal wing of the Tories is there has been some acceptance, not as much as we'd like, for example, that the banking sector does need tougher regulation, that we do need caps on bankers' bonuses. Probably haven't gone as far as we'd like them to, but they've done something. And also things like protecting the environment, worrying about climate change, has been a bit of something which the more liberal wing of conservatism has accepted to an extent. But that's almost like a complete bonfire of that. They've really gone straight to the right of their own party. As you say, it's a very small element of the public that have voted for Liz Truss in. But that's what you've got. You've really got a right-wing Tory in power, and the right wing of the right wing. And they're all using the wrong models. So apart from that, as they say, perfect.
Apart from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you enjoy the show?
Yes, pretty much. But it'd be interesting to see, won't it? Like, we've said before that world events tend to dictate what happens in economies. Obviously we've had the war in Ukraine, we've had other supply chain post-pandemic problems, we've had inflation from the supply side. People have tried to recharacterise that as government profligacy, increases in the money supply as a cause, not an effect. All that sort of nonsense. And so what might happen, say, for example, oil, gas prices rise, so don't rise as fast as the decline, inflation falls. The Bank of England will say, well, we did it because we put interest rates up. But it's nothing to do with them. And that's the issue, really, that there's so many variables at play that we don't really know what's going to happen in the future. Obviously, I hope, from the British economy's point of view, that world conditions are better. But the danger is that the policies that Truss and Kwarteng are going to do, I think, are more likely to make the situation worse. So, in a way, any success will be despite their policies, not because of them. And we all know that the wrong people often get blamed or credited for things. Like, I'm not saying the Labour government of, 2007-8 was blameless. They did deregulate the city. too much in common with most of the Western world. But to kind of blame Labour for the financial crisis in Britain when the Tories would have made it even worse is utterly ridiculous. It's just, who happens to be, in command at the time, cops the blame, don't they?
It was Labour playing at being Tories, so they were, following their playbook.
Yeah.
Looking at the international picture before we get back to the domestic picture, let's just talk about this Russian energy price cap. The G7, this is how I understand it. They formed a buyers cartel. They want to encourage sales of Russian oil at levels slightly above production costs to ensure that Russia's earnings are reduced, but not reduced to the point where they can't produce.
They want to limit their income.
Because as they see it, those foreign capital flows that come into Russia when they export oil, they think that's funding Russia's war. It
says here, Russia has already threatened to retaliate by banning oil exports to countries that implement the price cap.
Exactly. It just seems to me that even if the plan does dampen market demand for Russian oil, lowers the price on the international market, none of it gets around the fact that the importers of Russian oil need Russian oil more than Russia needs foreign revenue. I mean, am I missing anything?
No, I think Russia could hold out for longer not selling oil than they could hold out not buying oil.
It seems to me that Russia can sell oil to lots of places other than just, if you like, the Western Alliance. Now, I haven't looked at the data.
What I read on Reuters is that Russian production costs are $3 to $4 a barrel. So Russian firms could probably profit even if oil prices were like $25 to $30 a barrel. So this whole thing's going to work out great for China and India.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to hurt their ability to spend rubles to provision their war efforts.
No, I don't, logically, if they have a price cap at a certain level per barrel that they'll sell to all the countries that have agreed the price cap, then other countries like India and China can just agree, if they weren't part of the price cap, they can just agree to pay more than that and buy it all, leaving the West hasn't got any. And as you say, all of the money that the West, if there's any oil left that the Russians can't sell anywhere else and they can sell them to the West at whatever the cap price is to still make a profit. And all that does is, as you know, it'll bring in dollars, but it only stops them importing war materials. So they can obviously use rubles to buy war materials in their own country so they can pay their own soldiers in rubles. The taxes are in rubles, so they don't need rubles to run their war, unless they need to import materials and the people they're importing from won't accept rubles.
The thing that they need to import the most, I think, is technology for their weapons. But I think that they have been making deals with China. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, they recently made a deal with North Korea.
Yeah, I heard they were going to employ North Korean soldiers. I can't tell you whether that's true or not, but there was something I read in the paper saying that they were going to actually hire 100,000 North Korean soldiers as mercenaries.
So we don't get misinterpreted. Russia has committed an act of aggression, a war crime, and invaded a neighbouring state, a sovereign country. So we're not going yay Russia here at all. But we're just saying that these measures that are supposed to weaken Russia, they aren't working, and plenty of people said they're not going to work.
It's very difficult for me to believe that the G7 don't already know this and that there is actually an alternate motive for what they're doing. There was a suggestion that perhaps what they wanted to achieve wasn't so much as bringing Russia to heel, but to extend the war for, and make it as painful and lengthening it for as long as possible. They know that they're not dealing a final blow to Russia, but they're simply making things a little bit harder. There's another aspect of this that I'm quite worried about. In countries like Peru and other countries in South America and the developing world, there is an awful lot of reliance on imported fertilizers for food. And remember that the developed world imports a lot of food from the developing world. And we won't see this impact of the lack of fertilizers until the next season, harvest, let's say. So I think we'll see soon whether that has had an impact. But there is a potential for food shortages, aside from the energy shortages in the West from food shortages following, which I am quite worried about. I hope that that has been resolved somehow. But last I was following this news in Peru, it hadn't, or there was mixed news as to whether it had actually been resolved.
I'm trying to think back to the date, I can't remember, I think it was the mid-30s where Keynes was writing about the idea of being open politically and socially and internationally in terms of exchanges of ideas, movement of people. But he was very much against too much international complex entanglements with trade flows. And in a sense, we have such a complex global network of flows and knock-on effects. A bit like you were saying, Patricia, where you got like certain areas of the world who are exporting fertilizers to developing countries, who are then in turn relying on the fertilizers to produce food for themselves and maybe to export to earn foreign currency earnings for their development. Now, all these things have been knocked out of kilter. It's relatively straightforward for that to happen. If there's a war in a particular area, it can have, like throwing a pebble in a pond. It just has so many ripple effects. And what we've really seen with these disruptions is the West can employ sanctions. And I guess it feels it has to do that for moral reasons. Russia has attacked Ukraine, a sovereign country, an ally. They can't attack Russia militarily. It's a nuclear power. So the only thing it can really do is try and squeeze it, till the pipsqueak, as I said about the Germans after the war. That's all it can do. But the problem is that all it can do tactic, it doesn't work very well because a lot of the world are not on side, with the sanctions. Theoretically, they could have had more traction, but you've kind of left the back door open, haven't you, with, obviously the links to China and India and other countries. Now, that's not to say that the West shouldn't have done it. Like you said, it's not saying, well, there's nothing we can do. Russia's done something it shouldn't have done, invaded Ukraine, where the West is doing what it feels it needs to do, which is sanctions. But they just haven't worked, have they, the way the West thought. The politics of the war are very complicated. I don't understand all the stuff that goes on behind the scenes with the politics of the war, why it's lasted so long. There are a lot of stories about that. I don't know to what extent each one's right. I just know the lesson of this crisis is the world is extremely interconnected with supply chains. And that's the thing we've noticed after the pandemic. There was this stuff in economics where, comparative advantage, where each country does what it does best. And this has been conflated over maybe in the last 30, 40 years, particularly with like barge economics, where we've had all this outsourcing and where you get big businesses not going to countries to produce things because production there is more efficient in a real resource sense, like comparative advantage was talking about, but simply because it was cheaper. It might have been much less efficient in real resource sense. If you had a country where you lose twice as many real resources, but the wage rate was like 1/20th, it would still be cheaper to produce in that country. So then you got to, go out to another country, ship stuff across through very complex supply chains, maybe damaging the environment. And until I think there's a recognition that free trade, as it's called, isn't always good. And I know that's sacrilege. Everyone likes free trade. That we need to think more about the idea of fair trade, the idea of rewarding people more, if you like, morally, which is a bit more of an airy-fairy sort of idea, and being very aware of the danger of constantly making supply chains longer and more complicated, if you see what I mean, just on a purely economic sense. And certainly in recent years, that's the thing that struck me, how complicated and interrelated the world has become. And when we try and do the right thing, inverted commas, over Ukraine, it has very complicated long-term side effects that nobody really, well, I didn't expect. I didn't think the war would have lasted this long. I'll leave it to someone more qualified than me politically and as a historian to work that out. But I think a country like Britain, we need to think now about things we always say, building your infrastructure, going for full employment, making your supply chain simpler, moving away from free trade to fair trade, these sorts of things. if we kind of try to narrow our focus more on the economics.
So coming back to the domestic picture, among the things that Liz Truss campaigned on, we've got planning an emergency budget to set out measures that would get the economy growing in order to fund public services and the NHS. So there we are with we need to grow the economy. It's not because we want those people at the top to get those bonuses because they're the people that pay us. We want to grow the economy because we need to fund public services. And MMT people take a very dim view of that idea of how public services are funded.
In a sense, it reflects this, it's an ideological position, and you two both know it well, that it's the private sector that's productive in a very, like a deep sense, where all of the real goods and services are actually made, and a private sector input is a real income, in inverted commas, that's earned through production. And it's only the private sector production that matters. That, if you like, the public sector sort of, it's a bit like mushrooms growing on a tree trunk, you know. They sort of take a free ride on the private sector. And if you go back to the stuff we said about the Laffer curve, the idea is we need to grow the economy. And the best way to do that is this unproved, non-empirical idea of cutting taxes, more incentives, you know, bringing these wonderful bankers from foreign countries, etc. They'll come in, magically the economy will grow, because this is where it goes. And that will mean that because, if you like, the private sector is flourishing, if you like, our private sector tree has got a big tree trunk and the bark's looking healthy and all the little green leaves are all doing great. That means that the mushrooms of the public sector, which are on the trunk, are magically going to feed off that. And that is their vision, that the public sector, it's okay, but it's always reliant upon the large if you like, of the private sector. And they see these tax cuts, the Laffer curve, being part of that whole supply side stuff. And that's the whole logic of that. You've got to make the private sector work, because when you do that, then a happy side effect for ordinary people is a better health service, because we've got more money to do that with. And as we know, all of that is completely the wrong way around, because as we know from all crises, the private sector, which in that model is supposed to be the engine of growth, is always the one that fails. It's always the one that needs help. Financial crisis, it wasn't, to my memory, the big banks that were handing over loads of money to Ben Bernanke to fund the Fed. He said, so the way around, he just moved the numbers up. He looked at all these failing private sector businesses and simply handed over the money, rightly or wrongly. When people think he shouldn't have done, but he did it. So it's all in reverse. So if we look at it the other way around, the state, as we all know, spends money into existence, tax it back, which we've said. The government can never be revenue constrained with money. It doesn't need the private sector to support the public sector. That's all wrong. You might argue it's good to have a private sector because the private sector provides flexibility, innovation, freedom, all these things the private sector does. But that's because the public sector creates the environment for it to function in. So you've got it all the wrong way around. Warren always says they have it backwards. They have it backwards on interest rates. They have it backwards on taxes and spending. And sadly, they have it backwards on, which sector supports the other. And I think because Liz Truss is very much of the school that she's not a fan of the public sector, but she certainly sees it as something that feeds from the private sector. Whereas really, it's the other way around.
Just to jump in here and say that Liz Truss, and I think she's very much on the same page as her Chancellor, in a leadership debate, she was saying the Bank of England needs to do more to tackle inflation. And here's a quote from the leadership debate, quote, "We haven't been tough enough on the monetary supply," unquote. So, she's obviously an arch monetarist.
I really don't understand what she's doing. And I think I saw an article that was highlighting the kind of contradictions. She's trying to stimulate the economy, but she knows that by doing that, she is acting directly against what the Bank of England is trying to do, which is slow down the economy. how is this going to pan out? And I'm almost like very curious, morbidly curious to see.
Yeah, if you look to what they're doing, exactly what you guys are saying is that on the one hand, she's using some form of fiscal stimulus, cutting taxes, and then advocating for apparently a monetary contraction. So I guess if I'm not crediting her with more intelligence than she's got, I guess she's assuming that the reduction in taxes will have this magical effect of just making people work harder. No one thinks it's actually going to do that, but let's sort of assume we live in a fantasy land. So what happens is you cut the tax rate and everybody you say who's working a certain number of hours or working a certain level of hardness forever suddenly decides, because the taxes are lower, we're all going to work harder, so we've got a much bigger pie. And she's got that in a little box that it's separate from the other thing. And also, remember, there's all these wonderfully talented bankers out there in different countries, and they're all waiting by their private jets as we speak. And as soon as the bonus cap goes, they're all going to fly to the city, and the city, pardon the pun, is also going to fly. It's going to be super productive, and it's going to generate a bigger pie. So in other words, we've got a bigger pie of real stuff for Britain. It's growing. And separate to that, I think she's thinking, well, okay, we need higher interest rates for due inflation, but she hasn't got the intelligence to join the dots up. I float that up as a complete guess. You might think she doesn't think like that at all.
Well, I'm a bit more cynical. I think she knows what she's doing. I think she's going to turbocharge the rentier class. She's doing everything in her power so that, bonuses and everybody who already has money has more money. And then knowing that the actions of the Bank of England, if they try to slow down the economy, they're probably going to affect primarily, working class people. And they're going to create more unemployment. So it's just going to basically be the same thing that we've had over the last 10 years, but turbocharged.
So through the MMT lens, in the broad strokes, yes, lowering the overall tax burden on the whole economy leaves more spending power in the private sector. But there are other factors at play. For instance, if you are lucky enough to see a rise in your disposable income as a result of a tax cut, will you spend that money or will you save it? As the outlook gets more precarious for more people, perhaps people lucky enough to have the choice will save anyway rather than spend. So, would the tax cuts deliver growth, in the sense that they think tax cuts should deliver growth?
Well, I mean, the MMT perspective is that tax increases would free up resources. So when we're looking at what they're doing with taxes, I suppose, so there's more resources being sort of available for private sector people to buy. Therefore, in principle, there's fewer resources for the state to utilise. And you have to think, well, who are the tax cuts favouring and what sort of resources are they going to buy? And to me, I would break it down in that sense. So to me, the idea of tax cuts at this point seems reasonable. But if you're going to do that and you're going to give the private sector more scope to actually acquire more goods and services, is it the right group that you're doing that to? And the answer for me is an unequivocal no. Inequality is ridiculously high at the moment, as we all know. So if you're going to have tax cuts, it should certainly be on the lower earners, because they're the ones who you want to have more income to access through resources. I mean, as somebody said, it could have been Owen Jones said the Tory party gives just enough away and no more.
I kind of came up with a word for it. They've been masters of what I'm going to call just enough-onomics.
Yeah.
Yes, we, the British public, don't have that sort of Labour militancy that, say, like the French have. But it's not all entirely our fault. We're mostly governed by Conservatives. So, they're very good at calculating to the penny and to the corpse what we'll put up with in terms of underfunding the NHS and other public goods. And so, yeah, that's what I'm expected to see when it comes to so-called material support to ease the cost of living crisis.
I suppose if you put in a positive spin on from their point of view, they'll probably say, well, okay, we're doing things like reversing corporation tax so businesses can invest more, etc. We're reversing maybe the national insurance thing, which helped poorer people. And you'll hide behind that the huge benefits that the rich will get. And we're like fobbed off with the scraps that are being thrown to ordinary people.
There's a thing that Noam Chomsky once said that cuts through a lot of this, which is that if you look at it, that a politician's job is to sell their constituents out to their backers. That's pretty much...
Yeah.
That pretty much explains everything.
And the Tories are very, very good at that. I mean, they keep on winning elections. And I mean, I'm not an expert in politics, but people just keep on voting against their own interests.
Well, I think Labour keeps losing elections, which is...
Yes, I mean, and it is just like, well, that's something for another show. And, you know, we all get a bit hot under the collar, you know, and over that. But it is a bit crazy. And it just seems like we said earlier that we've just moved back 40 years. Maybe people were thinking, people can't remember we've done all this before and it failed. You know, and I've noticed there's been a big resurgence in monetarism. You know, people starting to talk about, you know, printing money causing inflation, when in a sense that's already been disproved because it only works, MV equals PT, because the money supply is exogenous. It's only if the money supply is the starting point, i.e., someone decides what the quantity of money is, and that moves across from one side of the equation to the other and cause prices. If the money supply is endogenous, determined in the system, we know that the quantity of money expands in line with the price level and the level of nominal income. So, yeah, you can do all these graphs with the money supply going up at the similar time and similar rate to the price level, but all the cause and effects the wrong way around. It's kind of made some sort of a comeback. And whether that's because in economics we can't really do controlled experiments, you know. So, I mean, I was talking to one of my groups and I was comparing monetarism to Flogiston Theory, you know, because we had this Flogiston Theory and for a while it seemed quite good and then it got disproved. And we still talk about it a bit occasionally in the history of science. It's a funny word and difficult to spell. It's quite funny. But people don't really talk about it as a realistic alternative to the contemporary views of, you know, chemistry and the way atoms and molecules interact. When monetarism's come back, you know, I don't know how it's done it. It's just Phlogiston Mark II. We're all in there, you know, that suddenly the money supply is exogenous again, apparently.
It's what the textbooks say. It's what the university textbooks say. Even the economists who teach these things don't believe them, but it's what students are told. So I think the internet is full of YouTube videos and bloggers who just take the textbook version and disseminate it as if it was truth. And of course, nobody really knows alternative views. If you don't know MMT, then it makes sense at a very superficial level.
I'm sure phlogiston made sail for a while, didn't it, in the 17th century?
Somebody's going to have to tell me what phlogiston theory is.
Basically, it was a mysterious substance, right? I'm reading now from Wikipedia. Phlogiston theory is a superseded scientific theory that postulated the existence of a fire-like element called phlogiston, contained within combustible bodies and released during combustion. The name comes from the ancient Greek, burning up, and the idea was first proposed in 1667. Now, the thing is, I think it's interesting, phlogiston theory. You know, it's an interesting study in how science moves, you know, like how we have paradigm shifts and it's possible, but it's hard. And I'm all for it being in the economics books as a little comparison with monetarism. But the difference is, if chemists have heard of phlogiston, it's an interesting thing that happened in the past. It's not something you're going to believe now and be taken seriously. But that's what we've got with monetarism. You know, it's still there. And it's like makes a comeback every time we've got inflation.
And it very much suits the shrink the state ideology.
Yeah,
and it all fits nice with Liz Truss's idea, shrink the state, and it all neat package.
And it makes sense in a very superficial sense, as I was saying.
Yeah. And I'm sure phlogiston did, you know, in 1667. Yeah, old Becker. I mean, they were all clapping. That makes sense. But obviously, as we know with economics, a lot of things are counterintuitive and they take a lot of effort to work it out. And that's the whole thing, you know, with Warren's stuff, talking about you have to spend first before you can tax. That's counterintuitive and it takes people to think about it. It's natural, isn't it, to assume that the government collects tax. It resonates with everybody. And the same way that, well, if people print a lot of money and chuck it in a system, it will cause prices to rise. And it's exacerbated by the fact that mainstream economists characterize the economy as like a giant auction. So you have like some equilibrium quantity that's given of stuff, and then you just chuck the money at it. And if you chuck more money at it, the price level keeps going up. So they don't look at the real institutional structures of an economy, and they get it in the wrong way around, and they can't get out of it. They're stuck in a rut,
Yeah, and the thing that cuts through that, obviously, is the insight that Warren popularized, which is that the currency is a simple monopoly, a simple public monopoly. Those supply and demand curves don't apply to monopolies.
Yes.
The quantity theory of money, as you pointed out, Christian, is just an attempt to justify controlling the state activity in the economy.
I think it's the way, if you're dealing with somebody who's like coming at you in I understand the quantity theory of money, I am smart. You go, okay, well, now add in the idea that because you're smart, now add in the idea that the currency is a monopoly. And what does that leave you with? The institutional analysis is that the currency is a monopoly.
And that would involve incorporating the real world in your analysis, Christian. You don't want to do that.
Well, I mean, if my memory serves me right, the Austrian school is a big school. But essentially, the Austrians don't believe in empiricism. They're not interested in a way.
Empiricism is corrupted to them, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the world's too complicated so that all your experiments can't work. So there's no point doing it, looking at the world. You just work it out from first principles. And obviously people try, don't they, to act in their best interest, maximize utility, get all the information that's available, make rational decisions, and all this sort of stuff. And even when the Austrian schools, they admit by their own, with the origin of money, they don't even pretend that it's meant to be based on the real world. It could have happened, and it's plausible. And the whole quantity theory makes sense in an imaginary world where the money supply is under the control of the state.
Because their imagination cannot possibly be biased, whereas the real world...
Exactly. I mean, this idea that neoclassicals, particularly, and Austrians, well, it depends, maybe, a lot of the time, they pretend to be value-free. But that's, of course, impossible. And if it was, it'd be boring.
And by the way, we've said this many times on the podcast. That's the reason why you're hearing us be quite overt about our political leanings on this podcast and in previous episodes and in episodes to come, is because we don't like to pretend that there is such a thing as a sort of bias-free perspective. We're trying to be overt about our biases. So sorry if they don't align with yours. But as I've said many times before, our biases still don't change the fact that governments only spend one way when they have floating exchange rate currencies, which is really the MMT insight that unlocks everything.
Ironically, with MMT, you get right-wingers who say MMT is a leftist project, which it's not. MMT, like you say, MMT simply explains reserve accounting. I mean, Warren says, got a popular movement, not on the environment or important, just on reserve accounting. It explains how the monetary system works. Now, obviously, people who are generally MMTers usually have a leftist perspective because they want to tap into that knowledge to make the world a better place. That's the point in doing MMT. That's why we're here, because we think, right, if we understand the system, we can do something with it. But it isn't a leftist project. And ironically, from the other side, some people who are also left but not MMTers say MMT needs to be more overtly left. And I've had criticism to, people telling me, oh, it's just a leftist project, and others saying it's not left-wing enough.
Yeah, it's where you need to sort of like decide whether the criticism is in good faith or not. And I think that a lot of the time people are like, well, I don't like left-wing political thought. And there are some left-wing people talking MMT, so I don't like MMT. So fair enough, we're not going to win you round. We're not going to make a centrist or somebody to the right of centre a left-wing person via MMT. It's not going to happen. And I'm quite happy with that.
From the conversation we've been having, I think we're all in agreement that we cannot present an idea without it being inherently biased. We're human beings. We cannot get rid of our biases, but we can try. And I think that, that's why MMTs sort of get flack from both sides, because, MMTs admit that they come from a lefty perspective, and that inevitably is going to affect the way that they describe the system. However, they can also make some effort in being as objective as humanly possible. Personally, I think the MMTs have got the balance right, and that if we went, to be fully political, then we would be losing something.
I think where this mistake comes from, where people who are centrists and to the right of centre say that the MMT is a left-wing project, is they think MMT equals just print money, or MMT equals deficits don't matter. And I really think what MMT is, if you had to boil it down, is money was designed to create unemployment for the further purpose of the authority or the state hiring the unemployed people that it caused to be unemployed via taxation. It's not as easy to assimilate as the quantity theory of money, for instance, and stuff like that. But, if you're going to critique MMT, you've got to get it right. And at the heart of it is that chartalism thing. So the reason why we're saying the deficit needs to go up is not because deficits don't matter, it's because there's involuntary unemployment. And the reason that we're saying to have a job guarantee is not because we're lefties. We're saying because, well, that's how you've employed everybody that needs a job and not spent any more beyond that, because we're bothered about inflation. So, it's about making sure that people understand, why we talk about deficits and the way we talk about them.
It's an interesting tension. I think you're absolutely right that why, someone could write about why MMTers tend to be left wing. And I mean, it's in a sense that if you're a right winger, you don't really need to go any further than neoclassical economics, because it suits you. You don't need to bother with anything new. It's the idea the private sector works. Everything's in equilibrium. Naturally, the government's seen as market failure, grit in the machine. And if you reduce the government, then that's absolutely fine. And you can see it fits nicely with the government being a nuisance and getting in the way. And so you don't want anything that empowers the government and makes, that the government might have a positive role. Whereas MMT is a different perspective, putting the government there at the start with money, not a late arrival on the scene who corrupts it. And it's a complex relationship. It's certainly clear to me that it's very difficult to convert a right winger to MMT, because I think once they thought they might be understanding it, they would panic and run away because their whole world would be in tatters,
So as we move into the home straight, in a foolhardy attempt to end on an upbeat note, are there any causes for optimism out there as you guys see it? For instance, any campaigns that people can get behind?
I think as Tony Benn said, we can't really be professional pessimists on the left. We've got to be positive. And I think that in terms of the politics, I'm very positive towards People's Alliance to the Left. I like that Enough is Enough campaign. And I think if the left is well organised, quite positive, and also stresses one or two key policies which are broadly understandable by the public and people can get behind it, that'll obviously put pressure on politicians to maybe move some way to adopting some progressive policies which are based upon an MMT perspective. So I think the future is reasonably bright, but obviously I don't be over optimistic. It's going to be a challenge.
Yeah.
So we need to give a shout out to the Enough is Enough campaign. Looks very promising. And I'll link to their website in the show notes. It's wesayenough.co.uk. And their demands are 1, a real pay rise, 2, slash energy bills, 3, end food poverty, 4, decent homes for all, and 5, tax the rich, which through the MMT lens is like, yep, we're definitely down with tax the rich, not because we need their money to spend on all those other things that we just said, but because it reduces wealth and income inequality.
Politically, I don't think the Tories' position is sustainable for much longer. I think something's got to give and we're going to see change. I don't know what shape that change is going to be. I think sometimes the advances from the left and people who want to do good, sometimes the left is dormant. And I think before, for example, Jeremy Corbyn came in or Bernie Sanders came in the US, the left was not it wasn't inexistent, it was just dormant. And then suddenly an opportunity arose and it kind of just ignited all this pent-up energy. And I think that can happen again, and when we least expect it. And I think that all we can do is try to be best positioned to take advantage of an opportunity like that arises. And I do hope that, having gone through the whole Jeremy Corbyn thing and Bernie Sanders thing, that the left is now wiser because of it, even if it wasn't entirely successful. And that, the next round will be much better.
Well, that's a great place to leave it. We've been speaking with economist and author Dr. Phil Armstrong. We'll link to where you can stay current with Phil's work in the show notes for this episode. But for now, thanks so much for joining us today again on the MMT podcast, Dr. Phil Armstrong.
Great to be with you both.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.